Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Perry with the Circle of Atonement, and I'm here with Circle founder Robert Perry. And today we're talking about rethinking spiritual authority. This is a very important question and a very serious and relevant question because for so many of us, spirituality and faith are a huge part of our lives. I found A Course in Miracles in 2011, and before long, it was all I wanted to read, and then it was all I wanted to teach, and then it became my career, and then Robert and I got married, and on it goes. And my story is not unique at all. Spiritual work pierces something very deep within us, and it has a way of taking over and upending our lives, which can be a healthy thing, or it can be a very unhealthy thing. And this brings us to the topic of spiritual authority, because what tends to happen is when we begin our spiritual journey, when we say there must be more to life than conventional things, we start to hunt around for teachers and leaders who can show us the way. And so then we're faced with the question of, who do we give our spiritual authority to? And this is a really pivotal place because we give our spiritual teachers access to our psyche to some degree. And that is a very sacred thing that is often viewed far too casually. Again, this is a huge topic. It's so much deeper than we can fully explore in the time that we have. But we've broken the structure for our discussion today into two parts: 4 signs of unhealthy spiritual authority and 4 signs of healthy spiritual authority. And Robert and I are obviously spiritual teachers. To be clear up front, we're not saying we've been perfect in these areas. We've freely admitted that we've made a lot of mistakes along the way in both our own journey as spiritual seekers and in our journey as teachers. Some of that we'll get into today. But this is a topic that we've wanted to discuss for a long time. So let's get into it, warts and all. And Robert, I know you wanted to say some things here at the beginning as well.
Yes, some of what we'll present here um, comes from a presentation I did a week ago for our study group leaders. And that was sort of the genesis of this from my standpoint. The topic has been simmering in my mind for so long. What happened is that Marianne had forwarded questions to me that she'd received, and the questions were about bringing in other course teachers and teachings. And this was followed by a list of several such teachers and sources. And my immediate thought, which I don't recall thinking before, um, was that usually I think, well, we should be measuring what they say against the course. How much does it agree? Which I think is the thing to say. But what I suddenly thought is there were so many people on that list that had some claim that everyone knows to ultimate authority. There were different kinds of claims, but they added up to I have total authority here when it comes to the course. Uh, and my thought was before we even get to the issue of how much their teachings match what the course says, we've got to deal with the huge power in our minds of those claims to total authority. Because those claims, as we're going to say, tend to turn our brain off. We have to appreciate the power of their pull on our minds.
This is going to be a very rich and interesting discussion, I can tell already. But as I mentioned in the introduction, we're breaking the episode down into 4 signs of unhealthy spiritual authority and 4 signs of healthy spiritual authority. So let's begin with unhealthy spiritual authority. What are the ways that we can tell that we may be in a potentially harmful zone with a spiritual teacher?
Well, let me preface this by saying that I think these 4 signs of spiritual, of basically a claim to total spiritual authority, they may not be in a potentially dangerous setting. They may, um, but they're still unhealthy. I can think of teachers who I absolutely respect their integrity, and they hit it out of the park on all four of these. And it doesn't mean that they lack integrity or they're somehow deficient as human beings, but something unhealthy, in my view, is going on when you score on all four. Okay. And I think we should be willing to say, okay, let's take my favorite spiritual teacher. How do they score on these four? And here's what the four are. Number one, directly in touch. There is a claim, whether implicit or explicit, to be directly in touch, meaning a claim to be enlightened, a claim to be awake, to be directly in touch with higher beings, to be in a higher state of consciousness, to have had experiences or have frequent experiences of direct knowing of spiritual reality. So that number one is directly in touch. Number two, total certainty. I watch for this when I listen to spiritual teachers. In this one, they speak with total certainty, as if everything is said as fact. They don't express normal human uncertainty, like I think, I feel, this is my opinion, this is how I see it, or I don't know. Like we all say those things, but these teachers just issue a stream of fact. Number three, lack of evidence. They provide little or no evidence for their conclusions, which would enable you to draw your own conclusions. So they don't say, here's where I got this, here's my support, and this is the conclusion I drew. They just say, this is the truth without any support. In fact, the implied support is, I just know. I don't need to give you a stack of evidence and logic and all that. Number four, never wrong. They don't admit or volunteer that they have been wrong. And maybe they were wrong before they woke up or whatever. But you don't hear them say, like, I just realized that I've been saying something for years and I don't think it's right. Or you don't hear them saying, I changed my mind about this, or I was wrong. Um, so that's the four. Number one, directly in touch. Number two, total certainty, speaking with total certainty. Number three, lack of evidence. And number four, never wrong.
It's quite a list, and it does say so much about what we're looking for as students in spiritual community. There is that thing where if someone says, okay, I'm in touch and I know, there is something in us that does kind of shut down and give authority to that person. And why are we so willing to do that? You and I have been talking about this. I've been thinking about this a lot. I think part of what it comes down to is life here is really hard. And so if someone comes along and they say, I know, trust me, I am directly in touch and I can lead you out of the desert, there's a relief in us. We're like, oh, thank God. And also, when there's something really unique about spirituality because there's a promise in spirituality that is so much of what we're looking for in life wrapped up into one thing. So we're looking for God, we're looking for purpose, we're looking for belonging, family, friendship, wisdom, knowledge, truth. We'll devote a career, we'll devote our lives to any one of those things. And spirituality gives us the promise of all of those things wrapped into one. And as I was saying before, it does ignite something very, very deep in us. And then we become willing to transfer authority without all the evidence and whatnot that you were talking about before. I just want to be very clear that we're not saying that some people don't have more ability to connect with higher consciousness. You like to call it thinner membranes, Robert. Some people just have thinner membranes. They're able to connect more easily. But when someone's making the I know claim, we as spiritual students need to be more discerning about how willing we are to give our authority to that claim alone.
One thing I want to say, you mentioned the I know claim. That really is the summary of all those 4 points. The 4 points are different ways of saying, I just know. That's why you don't provide evidence, right? You just know. That's why you're never wrong. That's why you don't say, I think or I feel, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the core. All four boil down to, I just know.
So, you were saying earlier that to understand this topic from a course perspective, you have to understand the difference between um, perception and knowledge from a course perspective. So, can you go into that a little bit?
Yes, this is really important. It's abstract, but once you understand the course's distinction between perception and knowledge, this whole thing sorts itself out. I've been ruminating on this for years and seeing that the nature of perception solves a lot of this for us. So let's just go take a little side trip into this issue. There is a section called Perception versus Knowledge. It's in chapter 3 of the text. At section 5 in the CE. I forget what section it is in the FIP. And for the first time in the course, it lays out these two modes of awareness, perception and knowledge. Starting with knowledge, it says to know is to be certain. The basic idea is that knowledge is something we have. This is not knowledge about facts, right? It's not knowing who won the World Series in 1981. It's it's knowledge that it's a state of awareness that only exists in heaven, beyond time and beyond space. The idea is with knowledge, you're directly in touch, so in touch that you know with absolute certainty to the point where your knowing of something and the thing itself are one and the same. Okay, so there's not even the tiniest sliver of room for error. You directly know what that thing is. It's like you're inside of it. Okay, that's knowledge. And then perception, actually the next section says perception always involves the mind in areas of uncertainty. So whereas knowledge is certain, you know, perception is uncertain, inherently uncertain. And the simple reason is that in the state of perception, you're separate from what you're trying to know. And you're getting information about it through your eyes and your ears. And you're trying to piece together what it is. You're drawing upon your fund of learning, your past experience, and you're trying to interpret what it is from the standpoint of you, from your personal standpoint. And we all know that is so it's inherently subjective, and different people can look at the same thing and have completely different perceptions of that thing. And so perception, because it's inherently uncertain, we can never be sure what that apple is, who that person is. Because of the uncertainty, it's constantly shifting and changing and rearranging as we see things in a different light. And that's the key. Perception is uncertain, knowledge is certain, and all we have down here is perception.
You can see, though, where the idea of certainty becomes really intoxicating because it is hard to live down here, and so much is uncertain. People let us down. We don't know what our purpose is. There are all kinds of different spiritual paths and faiths. It's hard to discern, okay, what's true and what's not true. And then there's trying to figure ourselves out, which is also incredibly hard. And so all of this creates a cloud of confusion in our mind. And so when someone comes along and says, I'm directly in touch with higher consciousness and I know. You can see why that would be intoxicating and why we are so willing to say, okay, I'm going to go along with whatever it is that you're telling me, because clearly it's coming from wisdom higher than my own. But you said something really interesting just now. It's that so often what you're seeing in certainty from spiritual authorities disagrees with one another. So one person's really certain about this thing that disagrees with this other thing that someone is really certain about. And someone has to be inaccurate, which proves the point that you're trying to make. We can't know.
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like we're going to develop that a bit more in a little bit. But I think that we just don't appreciate how hard it is to be uncertain all the time. We can turn over in bed and look at the person we've been married to for 20 years and think, I don't know who this person is. And that uncertainty is crippling. And so, as you were just saying, when someone comes along who says, I know, I feel like some ancient, almost like reptilian system is activated in us where our brains can turn off and we can just say, oh, thank God, I don't have to figure it out anymore. I don't have to be so uncertain. I can at last just rest in certainty because he knows. And the fact is that we need to really watch out for that. I think we've all seen people do it, right? Where it's alarming. Like suddenly they find so and so knows, but surely we've seen ourselves do it too, and later decided we were wrong. I think we have to appreciate that when we have that thing turn on in us and our brain turns off, we're putting ourselves in a very vulnerable position. And it might just be in terms of our beliefs, but it might be in terms of our money. It might be in terms of our bodies. So it's a big deal.
And you yourself have fallen victim to this. Do you want to share?
I have never fallen victim to this. No.
I know
Well,
that's not true.
yeah, I mean, I can look at so many instances because I really want that certainty. I've always turned to people who know, channels who know, experiences that are portals. I really am into all that stuff. And probably the most outstanding example in my past was for many years, I was a student of the Edgar Cayce readings. Now, I think Cayce was a great guy. I think the readings are great. Doesn't mean they're perfect, but once like Cayce would go into this trance, he would take the conscious Edgar Cayce offline, something deeper would come through, and you could ask him anything. You could ask him, you know, read this body living at this address with this birthday. And there were times when he said the body has died. And in fact, the person had died between the time the letter was sent. And I mean, it was amazing. And so you just think, well, maybe when he answers every question, they're all right. And I ended up believing all kinds of things that in the end they're kind of wacky.
You had said earlier that we were going to say more about authorities that are claiming to know that disagree with one another. So, do you want to say more about that idea?
I do. This is one of the main points I want to make here. And that is once you've evaluated that this person fits all four of those signs, right? Directly in touch, total certainty, lack of evidence, never wrong, all adding up to the claim of I just know. The first thing, in my view, you should say in your mind is they don't know. Okay. I think we all need to do that. They don't know. And why do I say that? First, as you were saying, Emily, they don't agree with each other. If you took all the spiritual, awakened, enlightened, whatever people in the world and stuck them in an auditorium, do you really think they would agree even on the basics? I'm talking the basics. okay, they would not. From the standpoint of each one of them, a whole bunch of the rest of them would be wrong. The other thing is, so they can't, just saying I know does not equal knowing. Um, the other thing is, everyone ends up saying things that are incorrect and demonstrably incorrect. And that includes those who claim they know. Now, you were saying, I better back that up. And it's delicate but here's how I will back that up. Obviously, my expertise in this life is A Course in Miracles. And the great thing about the Course is it's right there in black and white in English. And so there's a lot of subjectivity when it comes to the Course, but there are things that are not subjective. Okay. So if you said to me, lesson 95 in the workbook is nothing real can be threatened. Well, that's objectively false. Okay. And there are other things. If you said to me, lesson 95 in the workbook is this really important, unique discussion in the workbook where he talks about when you miss practice periods, and it makes it really clear that the whole point is to miss the practice periods and forgive yourself, and then you've gotten the point of the workbook. That's objectively false. Okay. In plain English, that lesson says virtually the opposite of that. So there are matters that are not subjective when it comes to the Course. And what I want to say is, in my last 40 years, I've seen many people who claim total authority, either because they're awakened, they're in touch with higher beings, whatever their story is of how they have total authority. I've seen them say things on that order about the Course that are objectively false, routinely objectively false, not like occasionally. And finally, the Course says that if you're on Earth, you're in perception and you don't know. And there's a line that I like to quote from the manual, section 23, that just flat out says it: no one on Earth can grasp what heaven is or what its one creator really means. He's saying flat out, no one on Earth grasps what heaven is or what God means. That's a very declarative statement. So I think that from my standpoint, when you see someone make that claim, even implicitly, I just know, say in your mind, no, they don't.
So, in essence, someone who's saying, I just know as a badge of spiritual authority, we should be thinking, well, that's actually takes away from your spiritual authority.
Absolutely. And this is one of the main things I want to emphasize here, too. When we hear that claim, something in us watches their authority elevate in our eyes. Suddenly, their sense of authority goes up and up and up in our mind. We need to take the dial and just move it down. Okay. Doesn't mean everything they're saying is wrong. Doesn't mean they aren't more in touch in many ways. Okay. There is such a thing as spiritual authority. Okay. It just means that their claim to know is a false claim. And therefore, it throws them into question. Such a big global false claim means, okay, they now have less authority in my eyes. Just 1 second. In my view, at the very least, it's a kind of innocent blindness. It's just plain naive. At the worst, it's an ego-based attempt to gain authority over you, to gain power over you.
Oh, there's so much there. But this is where I think we're handicapped a little bit in the spiritual community. Number one, because there's no credentials that you need to have to be a spiritual teacher. You can just say, oh, I had this great awakening, and now I'm going to tell you how to be in touch with truth. That's number one. If you're having surgery, you want to make sure that your doctor has a medical degree. Well, in spirituality, there's no equivalent. So anyone can say that they're a spiritual teacher. And also in spirituality, we've been so trained, and I'm seeing this a lot right now, we've been so trained that we want to be loving. We can't disagree with one another because disagreement feels like an unloving act. And so when someone steps forward and says, I know, and even steps forward, says, I know, and makes ridiculous claims, we don't stop and say, you know what, actually, can you back that up? Or can you tell me where you got that? Or no, I don't really agree with that. And here's my reasons why. We just think, no, I'm not going to say anything because that's his truth or her truth. And I've got my truth and it's okay. The loving thing is not to say anything. And then that allows all of this to continue. So you don't have to have any credentials, and we're not going to disagree with you. And then to your point about the ultimate authority being a way to turn our brains off and exercise control, do you want to say more about that? Because that's a very deep well.
Well, I just think that these days everybody is saying that thinking is the problem. It's amazing how popular that message has gotten. But while they're saying your thinking is the problem, they're giving you their thoughts, right? So their thoughts apparently aren't the problem. And while your brain turns off with the thought that they just know, meanwhile, their thoughts are just coming in with total authority. And I do think it's not a good mix. And I want to say that just going back a little bit, I want to say that I think there are different situations. So there are teachers out there who I think I don't question their integrity. Okay, and they score high on the I just know um, barometer. And I think, okay, I think they have integrity. And I think, unfortunately, they're just blind. They don't realize they don't know. Okay. But then there's a whole other thing that happens when somebody is using the claim to get your allegiance and your belief. And when someone is using the claim as a power device, that's when I think you head out the door and don't look back.
In the interest of time, let's move on to the course's authority.
Oh, we can't move on. Okay, I just want to say some things here
Okay. Okay.
about we need a healthy relationship with the authority of teachers. And what that means in my mind is we have to subject their claims to scrutiny like anyone else. Once they say, I know, we're like, fine, fine. And we're still going to subject everything you say to the same scrutiny anybody else would get. Okay. I think we do need authorities, but we let them earn our trust and never our total trust, which means we never just assume they're always right. No one's always right. Okay. No one's even close to always right. And we keep in touch with our own guidance. We keep in touch with our own reason, and we never turn our brain off. And I'm saying brain proudly there. Keep your brain online. Okay. You need it.
Yeah. We really do need to have more of an understanding as a discerning community that when a teacher asks you to turn your brain off and trust them as the sole source of authority, that is a form of control. And that's happening all around us. It's why civics classes aren't being taught in schools anymore, because when you don't know what your rights are, then you're less likely to want to fight for them. And it's a form of control. It's why we're being asked not to trust mainstream media, because if everything's confusing, then you're going to look to the person who can tell you what's going on. And that's a form of control. And the same thing happens in spiritual community. And I do think that not I mean, this is more in like the culty land of spiritual community, where you have the one leader with the absolute control who tells you that you can't trust your guidance, you can trust their guidance. And then you get into the community itself that says, we're the only ones who know. You don't know, we know. All of that is a way of exercising unhealthy spiritual authority, obviously. But it is about control. And we should be better at recognizing that that's what's going on there.
We should.
Okay, so let's move on to the course's authority because we obviously grant the course a lot of authority. We grant Helen a lot of spiritual authority. So how does that fit in here to the discussion that we're having?
I think it does. It can seem like a contradiction of everything we just said, but I think it does. Um, First of all, in my view, I was just talking about the need for someone to earn our trust in their authority. And when it comes to the course, it has spent 40 years earning that trust. Rather than taking the course's wisdom seriously because of its claim of authorship, I know you and I take its authorship claim seriously because of its wisdom. There is something about its wisdom that is unique. So we have come to believe, and we don't tell anybody, they just have to believe this. It's a belief each one comes to in their own time if they ever do. We've come to believe that the course did come from someone who has gone beyond perception, gone beyond time and space, and who truly knows. That being said, as the course is written, it's not a perfect product. Okay, there are errors. And having gone through the editing process with the CE, we had to do a lot of like grammatical corrections, things that, the author of the course cared about proper grammar. And there were a lot of grammatical errors in there. There are factual errors in there. At one point he says, the Bible says, know thyself. No, the Bible does not say, know thyself. It's wrong. Um, so it's not a perfect product. And the fact is, we don't know how much distortion happened. Even if you grant our claim that this came from a being beyond time and space who truly does just know, we don't know how much distortion happened as that information came through Helen's mind. Um, Finally, we think this is a very rare occurrence. And as a rare occurrence, it should earn that place in our mind, not just instantly gain it. We should go through a process of really responsibly deciding that this wisdom is beyond the human. And that's my main observation from 40 years. This wisdom is beyond the human. Um, so it's gone through a process of earning my trust rather than me just saying, well, it says Jesus wrote it, so turn my brain off.
Yeah, you got a good little phrase there. Rather than taking the course's wisdom seriously because of its authorship claim, we take its authorship claim seriously because of its wisdom. And that is so incredibly important because it feels like just like anybody can claim to be a spiritual teacher and gain authority, anyone can claim to channel Jesus and be granted some kind of spiritual authority because of that. But what's actually coming through with A Course in Miracles? There's a trust that you and I place in it because it does feel like a shaft of heaven come to earth. What he's asking us to do is so knee bucklingly beautiful and hard that it does feel like wisdom from beyond this realm. You and I were watching a podcast yesterday from a very well-known New Testament scholar whose view of Jesus is that he just wanted to come down, eradicate all the unbelievers on earth, set up the 12 tribes of Israel, and be king over the land. And if that were the course's view of Jesus, we would not be following this path because there's nothing unique about that. That is the basest of human impulses to get rid of all your enemies and come in and exert your own power and be in control. But what the course is saying is something far beyond that, something it's completely unheard of in its wisdom and in its beauty. And so often what happens is people will say that they're channels and whatnot, and what's coming through just feels like, you know, more of the same base human impulses. Do you want to say anything about that?
I do think that when someone claims to be channeling the author of the course, suddenly they are being held to a very high standard because what they say has to agree with what the course says. And in my experience, and I have some experience with this, I often mention that one of the Jesus channels from the 90s asked me to evaluate his work. Um, there are more contemporary works now that claim to channel the author of the course. And my experience is that there's usually a fundamental lack of understanding of the course. It sounds like the material sounds like a person who has had it soaked in a lot of influences outside the course, soaked in the course, but not really gotten it. And then something in them is coming out in the channeling process. If you're the author of the course and you don't understand the course, something's wrong there.
So a hallmark is the kind of wisdom that we know from Jesus in the course. And for me, if anyone's claiming to channel Jesus and whatever comes through has anyone left out of the circle of love, then it can't be him. Yeah, and
Well,
we
one of my
see that
favorite
all
stories. Sorry, go
we
ahead.
see that all the way back to the Bible, where the same guy who said love your enemies can't be the same guy who said I came to bring a sword. And so we have to decide as spiritual seekers and spiritual students what is accurate, and we have to do that for ourselves, and we can only do that when we turn our brain on. I don't know if you have time for a story, but go ahead.
We don't have time for this story, but for some reason it's happening. So there was a book in the 80s that was channeled by the author of the course, so called. And in this book, Jesus, put Jesus in quotes, would go on these rants. And the rants were hilarious. They'd be in all caps, like half a page of all caps. Um, and he would like inform world leaders that they were quarantined and they could not send like vehicles into space outside a certain distance from the Earth's surface. um, and it was just ridiculous and hilarious. I mean, if I had it now, we'd just all be cracking up. But obviously, the claim to channeling the author of the course doesn't mean anything. That new material has to prove itself to us in the same way that the course does by the quality of the wisdom.
So let's move on to the four signs of healthy spiritual authority. What are those in your view?
Okay, they're just the opposite of the four signs of unhealthy authority. And what I want to do is present these in light of how to see healthy authority being exercised out there, but also how to exercise healthy spiritual authority yourself. Many of us are in teaching roles. We may lead study groups. We may have our own even Course of Miracles ministries. So how can we model healthy spiritual authority ourselves? And how can we look for it out there in spiritual teachers? So number one, the unhealthy version was directly in touch. So the healthy version is don't telegraph how in touch you are. Don't parade your spiritual experiences to gain authority. Don't claim you're constantly guided. Rampant thing in the course community. Don't show off how spiritual you are. Okay. Number two, with the unhealthy was total certainty. With the healthy, it's freely express uncertainty. Now, I'm not saying that all you do is say, I don't know, I'm not sure. Um, we should all be appropriately confident. Be confident where we have earned that confidence, while peppering our speech with normal human uncertainty, like I think, I feel, I believe, I don't know, this is my opinion. There are some teachers who I like, but I would so love to hear one instance of, my opinion is like, wouldn't that be refreshing? Okay. Number three with the unhealthy was lack of evidence. So, number three with the healthy is cite your evidence. Provide evidence for what you say. This allows your audience to draw their own conclusions, right? There are many times, if I hear the evidence for something, like you're talking about that Jesus scholar, I then can think, I'm not sure that evidence adds up. You want to let people make up their own minds. Number four with the unhealthy was never wrong. And number four with the healthy is admit to having been wrong. Really volunteer, not as an extraordinary, moment, but as just a normal part of how you talk. Volunteer that you've been wrong. Feel free to say, I was mistaken. I changed my mind. I see this differently. Or even, I was wrong. Or even, I cannot believe I thought that. Um, Now, you'll lose followers for this. Just realize that if you're in a position of authority, people that thing won't go. They're the authority, but whatever's going on with you and your followers will be healthier for it.
That's exactly what I was just thinking as I was looking at this list. It's like, gosh, these are not the things that are rewarded for teaching spirituality in the world today. And we would know. Um, there's a temptation to telegraph how in touch that you are through claiming that you know, things that you wear. There's just an aura that you're supposed to project of authority and being spiritually connected and in touch with higher consciousness. The community is expecting some of that. And likewise with expressing uncertainty, I had a teacher that it was one of my partners many years ago, and whenever I would express uncertainty or let people into my process of how I made a decision, saying, well, I don't know about that, and then I landed here, she was like, don't let everyone see you bleeding on the battlefield. And I think that there's some temptation as teachers to, well, there's a clear temptation that you just want to say you're the one who knows because that's what the audience expects. I remember doing a podcast interview recently where I was talking about things that I was unsure of. And then I talked about a specific spiritual experience. And that's when he perked up and leaned in. And so, how am I supposed to respond to that as the person being interviewed? There's a thing in us that goes off. It's like, oh, okay, this is what works. This is what works. And
Sure.
then and then you get in trouble because then you're not teaching what you know to be true. You're bending to the pressure from the audience. And this is what we see with manifesting, for example. There's a real popularity with manifesting and with prosperity gospel. And if you want to be popular as a spiritual teacher, that needs to be part of your mix. But
Yeah.
that's the teacher bending to the audience. Do you see what I'm saying?
Oh, totally. Yeah. And we talk about this all the time.
So it's the tail wagging the dog there. You're not just saying this is what I know to be true and sharing it. You're checking the weather and saying what's going to
Sure.
make me popular, and then that becomes your teaching.
Yeah. Yeah. And to get back to the authority issue, where you started was we learn whether we consciously know it, we learn they want us to say, I'm awake. We learn they want us to say, I'm guided, I'm guided, I'm guided. Because people perk up. And an example I've used, and this is something I heard about in college because I was a psych major, and then I met somebody who had it done to him in class. And it's this old trick where you're learning about behaviorism and psychology, and it's all about how you can condition animals, you can condition people with rewards and punishments. And so what the students do is they decide that they will do it on the teacher while he's talking about it. So while he's talking, as he inches to one corner of the room, they look up. And when he stops inching, they all look down. And pretty soon, and this guy I know in Southern California, he said, I was in the corner of the room, and A, I didn't know how I got there, and B, I didn't know I was there. And that's such a parable. We suddenly were like the ones who know, who are always guided and we're awake. And we don't realize we got there through the audience conditioning us with rewards and punishments.
And another that I love that example because that is so analogous to what happens with spiritual teaching. The audience is subtly or overtly rewarding you for the messages that we all want to hear about how to have a life that's more comfortable and whatnot. And when you get into the realm of the extreme teachings of spiritual truth that appear in the course, particularly everybody is deserving of forgiveness no matter what they do because they didn't really do it. That's when you start to feel like it's an unpopular message. And as a teacher, you're like, well, no, I want to be over here talking about the
Yeah,
popular things.
yeah,
And
yeah,
if you succumb to that pressure, you're just like the professor, where you're on the other end of the room talking about the prosperity gospel and you don't know how you got there.
right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. We should move on. We're
I do
camping
want
out
to
on a
say
favorite topic of ours.
I do want to say one more thing about this, though. The whole idea of admitting that you're wrong as a marker of spiritual health. This is another thing I think we need to look at in society and in our spiritual communities, because there's less and less of an appreciation and a value these days of saying, you know what, I just got that wrong. There's a lot of pressure to just march through head up. I was right. Don't apologize. Don't
Yeah.
explain and don't apologize. And we're seeing that everywhere too. And that has bled into spiritual community. And I wish that we could kind of zoom back and rethink that, because it is a really healthy thing to say, I was so wrong about that. And even I was wrong and I'm sorry about that. And
Yeah.
we're less and less willing to do that. And I think that that's something that's taking us all backwards. Okay, so we've talked about the course's authority. Do you want to talk about our own authority and how we see ourselves as
Well, we
spiritual
have
teachers?
to. I mean, we had to deal with the course's authority. I mean, we're putting ourselves out there as authorities of a certain sort. So it would be a little bit creepy if we just didn't deal with that.
Okay, so as we close here, let's just put it out
But we
there.
have even more things to talk about after that.
Where do you feel like you've been on the healthy and the unhealthy side of this?
Well, I do have to say that I have really tried to measure up to those four signs of healthy authority. Never been big on claims of being advanced. And I've always been willing to say I was wrong, and this is my, here's my evidence. Um, but I do feel over time that I'm growing more in that direction. I look back, one of my issues is when someone says something declaratively, like this is fact, no uncertainty, no support, this is fact. And I look back and I see myself as having done that a lot in areas where I subsequently thought, oh, wait, I got that wrong. So I'm just saying this is the way it is. And then later I'm realizing that's not the way it is. And then it stings to think I was just coming out there and saying it as fact when it's not. Um, so as time goes on, I find myself consciously trying to move more and more fully into those four signs of healthy authority. In terms of citing evidence, and you know this very well, I want to cite a lot more evidence than I do, just because,
I know
we're not.
we'll be in like a podcast prep, and Robert will have six course quotes for to make the point that he wants to make. And I'm like, this is supposed to be a discussion. Could we not have all the quotes?
I think one good thing to say is that our community knows this about us. It knows that, we basically are trying to hit those four signs. Because when I presented this material about the four signs to our study group leaders, there was a lot of sense of people like, yeah, we know that you say those things. And that was nice to see, because we try to put the message out. We're just doing our best here to be faithful to the course, and it's an evolving process. We're not claiming any kind of perfection. We're not claiming any kind of I just know. It was nice to feel like our community gets that.
One thing I have appreciated about you along this line is you will say, I thought this a while ago about this passage or this lesson, but now I'm thinking something else, and here's why. And not trying to go back and justify why you thought something before, but just saying, yeah, I was wrong about that. The footnotes in the CE, oftentimes, I wasn't part of the production of the CE, but whenever I come across a footnote that says this seems to mean, or we think this means, I'm always appreciative of that versus just saying this is what it means for reasons that we've already discussed.
And we
I
hear that from people, which is great to hear. And there are footnotes that were said declaratively that are scheduled to be changed because we now think they're wrong.
Another thing that I think is important to this discussion is there's a real temptation, and this is more like circle insider baseball, but there's a real temptation in this community to say, well, Robert just knows, or Robert says,
I don't.
or
Do people say Robert just
yeah,
knows?
yeah, well, maybe not just
Okay,
knows. Maybe
I
I'll
see
take that
Lynn
back.
nodding her head. Lynn's
But
nodding her head. Lynn, don't
but
nod your head.
we see you can't do this in a podcast. You can't. Let me just back up and say that again. There's a real temptation in this community to say, well, Robert says, or to justify a point of view because, well, Robert says. And there's two things that we are constantly trying to say, and I just want to say it publicly so that it's on record, even though it's in all kinds of other recordings. The whole Robert says thing is an example of the kind of unhealth that we're talking about, and we're constantly trying to discourage it. So the idea is to say, yeah, I appreciate Robert's scholarship, but Jesus says it should be Jesus says, and then cite in the course where you're talking about, like if it's a quote. And then second to that, there is a lot of uh, the word I'm looking, there's people are impressed by what you know about the course and how you can just almost like categorically just say like where something in the course appears. You give you a quote and you know what chapter and section and even sometimes down to the sentence it is. And there's a lot of like, wow, it's like a party trick sometimes. And what I'm constantly saying is let's not do that. And if you spend 40 years with your nose in this book every day, then you will have that kind of recall as well. Maybe not. I do think that there's some gift that you have. I think there's some ability there that is like, I don't have it. But at the same time, I know if I spent 40 years every single day in this book, there would be a lot more recall there as well. So, let's not be so impressed with all of this. Like, let's just sort of take it off the teacher and put it into our own study because that's where it needs to be. And I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but it just felt like this was the opportunity to say some things that I like to say about this.
Well, I have some other things that I'm really invested in saying. I don't know if I want to if I should be the one speaking to like, how should you regard my authority with the course?
Okay, I want to say a couple of things very briefly about my own relationship with healthy and unhealthy spiritual authority. Because I feel like I've been rather lucky in what I've gotten to do here at the circle because I came in as the neophyte. Like I came in as the person who was the learner 7 years ago in conversation with you, started this podcast from the place of, hey, I just want to ask you some questions and let's record it because it might be interesting to other people. So I've never felt the pressure to like hold the authority here. And so I've seen the good side of that. And I've also seen the the less good side of that, where there's an appreciation for my role as the stand-in for the student who has questions. And then there's also this like, well, how much can she really know? And so I've had to kind of like climb the mountain of trying to gain spiritual authority without exercising some of the unhealthy patterns that we've talked about. And that's a fine line to cross because as a teacher, as I was saying before, I do feel the temptation, and this is relevant to study group leaders and others who are in our community. I do feel the temptation to lean into what's most interesting to the student. And I've learned the hard way that standing for the extreme spiritual truth of the course is hard. And so I'm still working through all of that, but it's just felt like something that I wanted to say. And I've seen the unhealthy side of this too, in the sense that when I was a Christian, I was more, I wouldn't say I was a fundamentalist Christian by any stretch, but I had absorbed some things from my Baptist church to the point where when my best friend Travis came back from India, he brought me this little statue of Ganesh. And I appreciated it and I took it and I was like, thank you. But I didn't want it in my home because I thought it was a false idol. And I am just thinking back on my life and I'm like, number one, who is that? Why did I grant such authority to something that was so obviously bizarre? Yeah, I couldn't have this little figurine in my home. So it's amazing that like how easily we can all get caught up in granting authority where it really shouldn't be placed. And the second thing I want to say is that at the very beginning of my time here at the Circle, I was kind of dazzled by all the potential of spirituality and having a life in spirituality, where, as I was saying before, it holds out the promise of here is a place where you can find truth and belonging and family and God and love and all of it. And it does do something that's like super intoxicating to us. And I didn't recognize when I first started at the Circle in my leadership role how much of a responsibility I had for the spiritual journey of other people. I was just sort of focused on, wow, this is really fun for me. And I want to name that. I just want to say that because that caused me to make some mistakes at the beginning of my tenure here at the Circle that I deeply regret. And I think it comes from getting caught up in the potential of a spiritual life without really recognizing the deep and sacred responsibility of a spiritual life. And I do see, and I would put where I was in this category, I do see teachers where it's more about the image of spirituality versus the deep responsibility that we have for the journeys of other people. So just
Yeah.
saying that.
Yeah.
And before we close, there was one last point that you wanted to make on this topic. So do you want to share that now?
We've been talking really about spiritual authority, but we've also been talking about the inherently uncertain and subjective nature of perception. And so while we're talking about this whole topic, I want to close by talking about how important it is, in my view, to live in an acknowledgement of the uncertain nature of perception. And the more I try to do that, the more it changes how I mentally conduct myself. What I find is that even though it's so uncertain down here and it's so crippling that it's uncertain, one of the ways we try to solve that is just by going into this false certainty. And we just have false certainty about all kinds of things. We all think we know this, we know that, we know the other thing when we don't. Um, and I think that's our attempt to compensate for the uncertainty of life. In fact, the Course even talks about this in the beginning of lesson 151. It says, no one can judge on partial evidence. That is not judgment. It is merely an opinion based on ignorance and doubt. Its seeming certainty is but a cloak for the uncertainty it would conceal. So we're feeling very uncertain down deep. And so we adopt this pose of the uncertain person, I'm sorry, of the certain person who just has no business being certain. We don't know enough. So over time, I have been trying and I'm still trying to live more and more in an acknowledgement of just how uncertain perception is for all of us. And so I want to encourage all of us to do that. And what that means is you keep an open mind. You say, I don't know, a lot. You gather facts and evidence first. You suspend judgment for as long as possible. You realize it's hazardous to guess where you don't know the facts. You consider everything subject to revision. You are constantly willing to say, okay, I'm seeing that differently. I got that wrong. Not as a big admission, because it's just the way you talk. Um, you're extremely flexible in your views. Rather than dealing with certainty, you deal in various measured levels of confidence. Anyway, my point is the longer I spend on this earth and spend time with the course's teachings on projection, the more I realize we're all like choking ourselves with false certainty. And we could have a much more open, fluid, humble, flexible mind in the face of a world where we just don't know. And I feel like the further I move, like by increments in that direction, better it feels, healthier it feels. It just feels like the way we should live.
There's something really freeing about saying, you know what? I actually don't know. Here's my best guess based on all that I've learned, but I don't know because we can't know.
Yeah.
And let's start there. Let's start a real conversation from there. So
Yeah. And I would love it. Getting back to spiritual authority, I know we're out of time. I would love it if our spiritual authorities modeled that. If they modeled, like, we've been talking about how towards the end of Bill's life, Bill Thetford's life, he thought of himself as flexible. And right before he died, he felt he'd achieved this, true flexibility. Um, and if our spiritual authorities could model that, you know, that would be incredible.
I feel like this conversation is to be continued because there's just so much more to say on this topic, but we are out of time, unfortunately. Robert, thank you for a great discussion as always. Thank you to all who have joined us live and who are watching the recording. If you would like to be part of our Exploring A Course in Miracles live podcast recordings, you're welcome to join our free community at community.circleofa.org. Once you're inside, just click on My Events and you'll see this one as well as all the other free events that we offer each week and resources for your Course in Miracles journey. On behalf of Robert and I and everyone at the Circle of Atonement, thank you so much for listening or watching, and bye for now.